For millions of years, humans thrived as nomadic, egalitarian hunter-gatherers. It was only around 10,000 years ago that a few societies around the world began to experiment with sedentism, agriculture, and hoarding of resources. These societies spurred feedback loops of growth, inequality, and environmental devastation, conquering and colonizing and domesticating everyone and everything in their path, causing the sixth mass extinction in the history of life on Earth. Today, we live in a world that is a mismatch of our evolution in more ways than one. We feel disconnected, isolated, and powerless. Can we find our way back to a life that better matches how humans ought to live? What can we learn about how to live well from other cultures who figured it out? Is there time to reverse our self-destructive trajectory? How can we reclaim our wildness? These are the themes of the Rewilding podcast. I'm your host, Peter Michael Bauer. This podcast is produced and made possible from supporters on Patreon. Thank you. If the Rewilding podcast inspires you, gives you hope, or makes you think, please subscribe, share it on social media, and become a patron at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. If you're new to rewilding or want to expand your perception of it, I recommend attending one of my Rewilding 101 workshops, which I offer both in person in Portland, Oregon, and online for those who live around the world via Zoom. You can check upcoming dates and register at rewildportland.com. Rewilding looks to reconnect people to a regenerative relationship with the lands where we dwell. Many people live lives currently that are dramatically linked to technological modernity. A return to a less technologically dependent life is not possible for everyone. Solar punk offers a potential transition type of living that could help soften the blow of a collapsing industrial technological system, or even may represent a kind of sustainable futurism. To talk with me today about this is Andrew Sage. Andrew Sage is a passionate writer, artist, and YouTuber hailing from the vibrant island nation of Trinidad and Tobago. As an ardent anarchist and firm believer in power to the people, Andrew has dedicated his efforts to invigorating imaginations and encouraging people to create a better world in the shell of the old. Thank you, Andrew, for coming on to the Rewilding podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I just want to say before I jump into questions that one of my favorite things about the work that you do, aside from it just being like visually interesting and succinct, is like you have just a captivating voice. Like it's it's
Aw.
like this meditative calm, and I feel like it does a really good job, not just because of the way that you structure content and make it like digestible for people, but there's something about the way that you talk and the cadence and the calmness of the voice that I also feel like helps just sink information into people's brains without like their nervous system getting all messed up. You know what I mean? Like sometimes people, I think particularly on like YouTube or other channels or other media, they're like ranting about things and they're like ranting in sort of an elevated way that can like push people into an elevated state, which I feel like can then prevent people from actually like integrating the information in a way that's maybe more useful. And I feel like
Yeah, I mean,
one of
pizza, please. I mean, my head is big enough.
well, I just want to say I appreciate it because I feel like it's a a calmingness that is really necessary in the milieu of like social media. And yeah, it makes you stand out. And that's one of the things that I really like about what you do and your
Appreciate it.
personality and what you
Appreciate it.
bring to it. Yeah. Um, I want to ask you, anarchism or anarchy means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and I know it's central to your uh your way of looking at the world. And so I kind of wanted to start there and just ask you, what is anarchism to you? And also, what challenges do you face in using that label?
Yeah, I think anarchy to me is, that beautiful idea. That's how I always tend to think of it, first and foremost. It's this vision and it's this approach to life, and it's a project that is really ongoing. What draws me to anarchism is that it is uncompromising in its opposition to all hierarchy and authority and all the different justifying dogmas. I consider it a personal philosophy, but I also consider it something that you practice, that you put in the efforts to resist these injustices around the world, and that you continue to pursue autonomy for yourself and for others, mutuality in how you engage with other people, and true freedom that uplifts, that expands, that allows people to live their fullest and be their bestest selves. The trouble, of course, is that while I see anarchy as a beautiful idea, and I see the rainbow, the goal at the end of the rainbow, whatever you want to call it, a lot of people don't have that sort of understanding of what anarchy is. I hear that word and I think beautiful things. Others hear that word and they think chaos, the purge, you know, um, just Mad Max,
Hmm.
utter destruction and violence. And part of this is just by design in the sense that, the states, capitalists, all these powers that be, they want us to think that we cannot live without them. They want us to think that without them being in charge, that we will descend into Hobbesian despair, right? But, you know, that's just not true.
Hmm.
We don't need them. They need us to not realize that we don't need them. But I also think that the reason people's minds go to that is because we've sort of bought into that mythology. It's not just that the capitalists and the politicians want us to believe it and need us to believe it and are pushing messages about it to create that perception. It's also within ourselves because of the world that we've grown up in and we've been raised in. We don't trust our own initiative. We are rusty in our practice of freedom. And so it is inconceivable for a lot of people that we can organize collectively and live in that manner without the state, without capitalists, without, all these other intimate authoritarians and for systems of patriarchy and racial hierarchy and all the different ways that we've deprived people of practicing their autonomy and of organizing in common without domination. And so the difficulty for me is, I don't have difficulty embracing the label, and nor do I have difficulty necessarily explaining it to others. But I think the difficulty comes in really recognizing the uphill battle that explaining and pursuing anarchy requires and accepting that challenge every day, refusing to see the seeming impossibility of the gargantuan task before me as insurmountable, but pushing forward anyway.
Yeah, awesome. My next question is, what is solar punk? And uh, where did solar punk emerge and what were the influences behind it? To me, just to kind of throw this out here as sort of a joke, but from an outside perspective, when I look at like the imagery of solar punk and stuff, to me it looks like permaculture with the internet. Like that's kind of like, I remember anyway. So I'm curious, like how do you define it? What are the influences that made it happen? And and then of course, like the next part will be how does that relate back to anarchy?
I think to understand solar punk, you have to look at the two components of the compound grid, the solar and the punk. For me, the solar comes in understanding the life and energy that exists all around us and tapping into that in ways that are not harmful, in ways that are not extractive, in ways that are generative. The solar in solar punk is not just, solar panels. It is also the energy, the light energy that grows the plants that we need to
Mm,
survive, that feed the animals that we,
mm,
engage in relationships with, that, powers our cities, that heats our homes. That solar and engaging with that solar in a way that is sustainable and generative is that aspect, I think, of the solar punk label. And also, I think the solar represents it being a shining vision, something that is bright, something that is hopeful. And the
Mm.
punk, some people see that as the inverse, as something that clashes with that hopeful vision. And I'm gonna nerd out a little bit and say that I really appreciated that in James Gunn's Superman. I don't know if you saw it.
I did.
That he had that line in there that spoke about, actually, hope is punk. Being
Mhm.
hopeful, being
Right.
trusting in people, that is the real punk.
Right.
That's the real punk rock.
Hmm.
I think that the punk of solar punk is not just the punk of rejecting the doomerism and despair that permeates the status quo. I think it's also the punk of choosing to resist the powers that be. Solar punk, I don't think is necessarily anarchic in all of its interpretations, and I don't claim to hold the sole interpretation of solar punk. But I will say that I think the punk in solar punk fully realized comes when we reject all of these systems of domination that get in the way of us engaging with the solar, engaging with the nature, having sustainable relationships with the natural world and being part of that natural world. And so the actions that we take to resist, whether it be the narratives of the ruling class or to physically resist their systems, their infrastructure, and to build an alternative, all of that falls into the punk for me. And so solar punk as an idea, it is a vision, it's something that we strive for. It is a movement in the sense that people all over who are working on contributing to it in different ways, through different channels. And it is also a genre because it is inspiring the stories that will fuel the visions of the movement building that better world.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think of the word futurism, which I don't think I don't use that too often, but the idea of conceptualizing potential future realities or imagining what the future could look like from that place of hope and a place of kind of like, I think not extending too far from what we perceive of as life today. I think in rewilding in
Mhm.
particular, a lot of things or a lot of like future concepts are like humans living as, Stone Age level hunter-gatherers again, which isn't which isn't as appealing, I think, to a lot of people who are used to contemporary society. And I think a lot of that idea comes from the kind of romanticization of that lifestyle, which I fall into that trap from time to time. But I also think that like, there isn't enough like megafauna that exists today to sustain human populations. And when I think about something like solar punk, to me, it's a way of rewilding and I think more realistic or pragmatic kind of way where we can, whether you think of it as an end goal or a transition into a something else, I feel like it offers up like the visual imagery in particular of what that transition or what that future might look like. Um, I'm curious to get your perspective on like, what level of technology do you think is actually sustainable? And one of the things that, kind of comes back to this is like the idea of something like a solar panel, requires that people are like mining minerals and non-renewable resources from the earth. And contemporary society does this through slave labor, essentially, and
Yeah.
destroying the environment and things like that. And so my question around like solar punk and why I think of it is it a transition or is it something else? Is that the question arises like who's going to want to dig up these things and build this industrial or what is now coming from industrial infrastructure if they're not forced into doing it. And so that kind of
Yeah,
also
yeah.
comes to this question of like what level of technology is actually sustainable and why I think a lot of people in rewilding see the future as like a Stone Age level of technology because a lot of what we use today is like a product of industrialism or industrialization, and the burning of fossil fuels and things like that. So I'm curious what your take is on that in terms of like the futurism of solar punk.
Yeah, part of why I emphasize that the solar in solar punk is not exclusive to solar panels is exactly that. Recognizing the issues with solar panels as a technology, not necessarily rejecting them outright and totally, but understanding that we do have to take on this kind of critical engagement with technology. You know, we're not going to snap our fingers and go into a Stone Age world, nor should we.
Right.
Even if the entire system were to collapse in an instant, there would still be remnants of technologies all over the place because it's so thoroughly integrated in our society and it's not going anywhere anytime soon. And I think it would be a tremendous waste to just discard those technologies and, try to retreat into a forest. Um, and it's necessary, in some cases for people to actually live,
Totally.
right? People's,
Yes.
yeah, people's lives are dependent on it. And so I think while I wouldn't make any prescriptions as to what level of technology is the totally most sustainable, I mean, it's something I'm grappling with and something I'm not fully educated with. But I do think that at least my interpretation of solar punk is fairly tech critical and tech critical in its approach. And I think taking on a tech critical approach is how we can, try to effectively engage with the contradictions of sustainability and, useful technology. Because we have to strike some kind of balance. We're not going to ascend to another plane of existence where we have zero impact on nature at
Right.
all. I think we do need to balance the ways that we do impact nature negatively with ways we impact it positively, and deciding what those trade-offs are, I think are going to be very location specific. I think they should not be contributing to the imperial core periphery relationship that we see around the world today. And I think it starts with us really practicing asking certain questions, not just about the technologies that we already have, but also about these new technologies that are being introduced. Do I actually need, this, what is it, like an Apple Glass or Meta Glass
Right.
pair of glasses, or like, do I need like a smart ring or, a smart watch or a smart this and that? Um, Being measured and critical in the technologies that we currently consume. This whole AI thing, not engaging with that for more reasons than just the environment. But I think environment is reason enough to
Totally.
not utilize it.
Yeah.
But I actually have a video on, how we can be more tech critical, and it talks about some of the questions we need to be asking ourselves, asking questions about the ecological impact, the social impact, the moral considerations and ethical considerations. All of that should go into the aesthetic quality, the political and practical questions around it as well. All of that really should inform how we approach any technology, and especially how we envision and work towards a solar punk world.
Awesome. Yeah. One thing that comes to my mind too in this is like, in particular with anarchism or envisioning the future and thinking about dismantling empire and systems of oppression and how that um, reflects sort of the fascist inversion of that, which is the accelerationism. So, if people are unfamiliar, accelerationism is the idea among a lot of right-wing ethno-nationalists, white supremacists, that their objective is to take down larger empires to create a power vacuum that then they can fill. And we kind of see this already
Mm,
starting to kind of take place around the world. And, early on in my rewilding, I think I was much more into the idea of like bringing down civilization as a means to the end of rewilding. And I think more and more lately, and in particular, I mean, over the last decade easily, but um, lately with the rise of fascism, it's really clear to see that if there aren't systems in place already, or that there aren't leveling mechanisms that prevent people from taking power again, if that were even if it were even possible to dismantle empire to the degree that we would prefer, the type of leveling mechanisms that could prevent the vacuum of power from being filled by white supremacists and fascists, like I don't see it existing. And I'm wondering if that's anything that you've ever thought about, because it just came to my mind. I know it's not on our list of questions, but it's something that I think about a lot in terms of like trying to envision and make a future possible while considering how to dismantle systems of oppression. Like, are there leveling mechanisms that we could put in place that would prevent fascists from gaining power again? And I don't know if you have the answer to that or if you have thoughts on it.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that anarchists have to talk about a lot, both to clear up the misconception that anarchy is just a vacuum of power or an absence of organization, but also to speak of anarchy as a process. So anarchy, contrary to perhaps popular belief, is not an absence of organization. It's an absence of hierarchical organization, but hierarchy is not the only form that organization can take. And anarchy as a process entails developing not only the organizational infrastructure, but also the cultural infrastructure that would enable us to effectively resist hierarchy, to resist fascist resurgence and fascist attempts at gaining power, and authoritarians in general's attempts at gaining power. You know, while these historic societies were not necessarily anarchist, we can see in certain egalitarian societies that there were practices embedded in the culture itself that allowed them to retain that anti-authoritarian ethos, to retain their relative freedom over generations, over centuries, over millennia. So it's a cultural struggle, at least for anarchists, to develop that anti-authoritarian ethos, to develop people's practice in and trust in themselves, and practice in engaging with others in egalitarian and anarchic forms. And that is what will develop the culture that is capable of not only resisting existing forms of authority, but also recognizing and stamping down attempts to redevelop that authority as, we progress further in the transition.
Yeah. It makes me think of, one of my first influences was Daniel Quinn. I don't know if you've ever heard of him or read any of his stuff.
Yes.
Um, but in one of his books, it was actually my least favorite. It was called Beyond Civilization, Humanity's Next Great Adventure. And I think he didn't really understand hierarchy. And so he didn't understand why
Yeah.
people
I've
needed
only
to
read two of
resist.
his books, Beyond Civilization and Ishmael,
Okay.
so I know
Yeah.
exactly what you're talking about with Beyond
Yeah.
Civilization. Yeah.
But the one thing that he did talk about in there was this notion of like a meme or, a cultural ideology that um, that would explain to people why they would not want to rebuild civilization, what, he didn't necessarily define civilization the way I do, but he would say to make it to prevent people from rebuilding an empire, a
Yeah.
totalitarian empire. And, a lot of that is just like understanding the material culture that leads to that. And so I think, a lot of the work that we do isn't even, is just essentially legitimizing anarchy. It's legitimizing rewilding, legitimizing solar punk in these ways that people fully actually can grasp the notion of why you don't want to build these things. Um, and I don't know if you've read any Martin Prechtel. He's a half native, half Swiss man who lived with the Mayans in the 1980s, and he's written a bunch of books about it. But one of the things he talks about there is their post-collapse Mayan society had this whole system called what he calls it spiritual debt, Um, and it was essentially like a way, it was a cultural limitation to consumption in that like anything that you wanted to consume, you had to like create ritual offerings in order to harvest a plant or to harvest stone from the earth. Like you had to write a song to sing to it. And like every step of the way had like offerings you had to give. And so it became like really involved to produce things. And so people just
Yeah.
opted to not consume them because of the level of involvement that they would have to get. Um, and I think about that as something interesting in that sort of vein of like these cultural limitations to consumption, or that could lead to, accumulation, which could lead to, the hierarchies that sort of require accumulation in order to produce themselves. Um,
Yeah, I also want to add there, I think that exactly what you were talking about with regards to developing those cultural memes. It's actually something I touched on in a video that I did, I believe, last year. Um, that I'd done after I'd read one of Daniel Quinn's books.
mm,
Um, and that sort of, I think one of the takeaways I had from reading that and from working on the video was that it's not just a matter of developing that, of resisting the memes that permeate our culture now about, this way is the only way of doing things, that this system is eternal, all these different things. It's also about introducing a new meme that can
totally.
replace, that former
Yes.
meme.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that's exactly what solar punk is, to a degree, right? There's a whole mosaic of ideas and things
I
that
think
need
there's
to
a
be.
mosaic of memes within the solar
Hmm.
punk meme for sure.
Totally. Yeah. Awesome. So I guess that kind of answers the question, do you see solar punk as kind of a goal or as a transition to something else? But I just want to ask that anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's both because there are people who take solar punk and they just look at it as the vision, as a speculative future, as this, hunky-dory future society. And that's cool, and I think that's important. But what I like to emphasize as well, similarly with anarchy, is that anarchy is not just a destination, it's also the process of getting there. I think similarly, solar punk as a movement has to be focused on that transition, on the actions we take here and now to nudge us closer to that goal.
Awesome. Cool. I want to shift gears a little bit. Uh, I Years ago I read this book called Gone to Croatan, which was a collection of essays about people who lived beyond the frontier in what is now the United States. And the title Gone to Croatan comes from the original European colony on the East Coast here, the Roanoke colony, which basically disappeared. They built the colony, people left to go back to England, and when they came back, the colony was abandoned, and all there was a sign in the abandonment that said Croatan, and people were like, "What does
Yeah,
this
I've
mean?"
heard of that book. It's on it's been on my to read list for the longest while.
Honestly, there's probably better books about those cultures. It's pretty old at this point, but um, that was where I first learned about the Maroons. Was they had a chapter in that book on the Maroons, and I became
Hmm.
really interested in Maroon society because you never really hear much about people kind of living beyond the Euro-centered settler colonial project in the United States, other than like tribes that were maybe being colonized or resisting or forming coalitions to resist or whatever, or like fleeing. You never really hear about other societies that were developed in the wake of the colonial frontier. And I know that you also have an interest in Maroons, because at the
Yes.
conference you led a talk about them. So I'd love it if you could introduce my audience to the Maroons and just talk about them for a little bit, and then maybe I'll think of some other questions around them to ask.
Sure. I mean, the Maroons were really a phenomenon took place during the colonial. period of the Americas, the early colonial period of the Americas, as enslaved people were brought, through the transatlantic trade to the Caribbean, to South America, to North America. They found many ways to resist, right? While in Africa, they resisted, they fought against their capture. While on the ships, they, in some cases, mutiny, they took over the ship. In other cases, they threw themselves off the ships. And once arriving at their port of final destination, whether it be Brazil, whether it be Jamaica, whether it be Trinidad, whether it be Barbados, the United States, some enslaved people were able to escape their plantations and either temporarily or permanently find their freedom. Now, there are two forms of maroonage really in history. There's petit maroonage and grand maroonage. The petit maroonage is the forms of maroonage that were mostly temporary, temporary reprieves. You walk off of the plantation, you run away, you go to try and find the family that you were separated from. You go to spend a few months away and then you return or were captured. And in some cases, Maroons were able to, leave their plantations permanently and find a free or semi-free life elsewhere. But the grand maroonage is the more, historically flashy form. That's the form of maroonage that established societies on the fringes, deep in the jungles of Suriname and Guyana and and Jamaica and Brazil. In the case of Brazil, there was, the establishment of a practical city of hundreds, if not thousands, of Maroons. And these weren't just formerly enslaved Africans. They may have also been, natives, and in some cases, even indentured laborers from the colonial societies, whether they were European indentures or indentures from other parts of the world. Brazil was a particularly special case in that regard.
Hmm.
From what I know, most instances of maroonage were African societies exclusively. In Jamaica, there were multiple instances, and they fought wars, and in some cases won, and in some cases the Maroons had to negotiate for their freedom. And some of the terms of that negotiation may have included having to return any future attempted Maroons to the colonial society, which in some cases they did do, in other cases they refused to do. But in Jamaica, the Maroons have survived up to the present day, the same as in Suriname. And in the United States, the Maroons were able to live freely all over, the American wilderness, in the Dismal Swamp, most famously. And I take a lot of inspiration from that decision to risk it all, to venture into an utterly unfamiliar land because, freedom was more valuable than the stability, though not safety, of bondage.
Mm-hmm.
I take hikes every once in a while and, we have trails cut, that you're supposed to follow along. But even on those trails, I look around sometimes and I'm like, there was a point in time when most of Trinidad was just this, it's just this kind of jungle, or in some cases, savanna or grassland and or swampland. And I try to put myself in the perspective of, my ancestors, of those that came before me, to think that, you are brought across an ocean to this completely unfamiliar land and you venture out and somehow manage to not only survive, but in some cases establish thriving communities that were able to resist, that were able to form successive generations. I think that sort of withdrawal and active resistance is something that we can consider in these, new forms of domination that really mirror some of those older forms of domination. And while I'm not saying that we just all withdraw from the system and, create little communes on the fringes, we have to fight at the places where the exploitation is happening most. But I think to the example of Haiti, where the maroon communities in Haiti were able to support and sustain the resistance struggle that formed the Haitian Revolution. And I think that is an inspiration that we can also look to in our
Awesome.
struggle for a better future.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. That's a really good summation. I hope you're enjoying this episode of the Rewilding podcast. I wanted to pause and make a request for your support. This podcast is made possible by donations on Patreon. With so much media filled with misinformation and outright lies these days, small, independent outlets like mine are some of the only ones left striving for brave, truthful inquiry. I need your support to continue bringing you thoughtful, hopeful discourse on human resilience. Please become a patron of the podcast at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. Thank you for supporting my project. The world needs this. Um, I think for me it was really inspiring for the same reasons, and I think growing up here in the States, I think a lot of the propaganda around slavery, even when it was anti-slavery propaganda, like the film, the television series Roots or something along those lines, it makes it seem like um, enslaved people just kind of either tried to run to the north or like just stayed enslaved. Like they didn't have the capability of fighting back or going out and creating these communities outside of the control of the colonial project. And it erases that, right? It erases the
Yeah, it's
autonomy
it's
that
almost meant
people were
to
able to claim.
yeah, it's meant to almost erase it as an option.
Exactly.
That's something to even consider.
Exactly. When it was actually pretty prevalent, to the fact where they're finding these villages, like in the Great Dismal Swamp, where there were potentially 1,000 or more people living there. It was just they had to find these places on the fringes that were hard to get to. I'm sure you've read James Scott's The Art of Not Being Governed.
Yes.
And in that, he kind of outlines, he's talking about Southeast Asia and the mountain ranges there, but they're very similar in a lot of ways that these people were essentially seeking refuge from the rice paddy states below in the valleys by finding their autonomy and freedom by living up in the hills. Um, and he has this sort of like list of things in that book. He's not like proscribing anything or he's not like saying here's how to do it, but it's kind of subvertly in there. It's like here's how to create distance and what he calls friction between you and the state, right? And he kind of outlines these different things like distance, but also like rough terrain. Like if you think about where like hunter-gatherer societies still exist today are in these fringe zones that are like hard to get to or hard to irrigate. Or, like, so you think of like
Yeah.
head for the hills, right? Like that expression.
Geography has definitely been a point of resistance.
Totally.
I think
Yeah,
the sad part is though that in a time that is what we observe now, right? In a time where states dominate much of the planet.
exactly. Yes,
And what's unfortunate is I think back to before, that period before the states were so dominant, where that prime real estate, and I hate to use that
totally.
term for the land, but
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
most
Yeah.
fertile lands were where our hunter-gatherer ancestors thrived, our
Yep.
foraging ancestors
Totally.
thrived.
Yes.
There was a reason that foragers were taller and healthier and fitter
Hmm.
than their pastoral or their farming
Yep.
neighbors, that they had more
Totally.
diverse diets, that they were less malnourished compared
Hmm.
to their farming neighbors. And, it's hard for us to conceive of that now because much of the best land has been taken over by settled peoples. But
Hmm.
there's a reason that humans were nomadic, were foragers for hundreds of thousands of years. It
Hmm.
wasn't just because we hadn't figured out how to put a seed in the ground yet.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and to your point, in saying,
Oh,
that the go
I
ahead.
mean, necessary disclaimer, apparently. Obviously, I don't think it was all sunshine and rainbows,
Sure,
being a forager.
sure,
Lots of infant mortality and that sort of thing.
sure. Yeah.
I'm not a primitivist.
You could still, well, yeah, I'm not a primitivist either to the degree that I don't want to romanticize a way of life, but this is how I explain it in my Rewilding 101 class is like I use a sports metaphor, which is funny because I don't really watch sports. But
Hmm.
in my 20s, there was the Pistons were going against, whatever, they were in the NBA championship, and I ended up watching it with some people, and there was this whole conversation around like why they were able to win that year was because of their teamwork, and there was all these analysis going on, and I thought it was interesting because when I look at humans in prehistory or contemporary hunter-gatherers, what I see isn't like the romanticization that what I see is like a group of people working together, meeting their needs in ways that the majority of humans find value and doing it better than the majority of human societies that exist today, right? So you could look at the two teams that were playing against each other or the all of the different uh, games that the Pistons played that season, and you could like romanticize them like, wow, they were so good. They're just like innately good at what they do. But it was like, no, you could look at like how they trained, what they did, what the different players were good at, and how they coalesced into winning that game, right? Or winning game after game and being
Yeah,
able to win the championship. And there's no romanticization there. It's just analysis of how they were able to accomplish this goal, right? And I think of societies as a group of people that come together to accomplish a goal of some kind or other, usually subsistence. Um, and so if we're looking at like hunter-gatherers or whatever, you can look at them not as like some element of perfection, but just simply people that were accomplishing the goals of coming together to get subsistence in a regenerative way and a equal way, through their egalitarian social structures in a way that people today try to find value in or try to reproduce but are unable to. And so I think it's more of just sort of like looking at it through that analysis and being like, these people have it better if you're looking at better through the lens of like meeting individuals' needs for autonomy, for health and happiness, and living in a way that's regenerative in the land. So
yeah,
again, while there may be things like infant mortality or other things, and there's no such thing as perfection. Every way of life has trade-offs to different degrees. What way of life was fulfilling the needs of humans more than any other that we can see? And that was
yeah,
and is today immediate return hunter-gatherers. At least that's just, through anthropology. There's other contemporary societies that have similar rates of like happiness, like Nordic countries and things like that when compared to like the Hadzame. But still, it's like you don't have to look at it through the lens of romanticization or primitivism, just rather like what are the examples that exist
yeah.
and
I
why are
think
they that?
actually solar punk has the potential to offer some of those benefits of the immediate return hunter gatherers.
Totally.
Particularly, I look at one of my favorite aspects that has been folded into the solar punk project, which is the idea of food forests,
Hmm.
right? There
Yes.
was a time where much of the world was a food forest
Yes.
for the foragers. And
Yes.
if we go about planting those food forests and, creating that kind of sustainable generative abundance, you know, we can,
Exactly.
in some cases,
Yeah.
live as they did
Totally.
in terms of foraging. You,
Exactly.
you venture out, you pick up, your potatoes for breakfast or whatever, and you get some berries to go with it, and you have a little something going on there.
Yeah. And I just want to also just say to your point, that in speaking of the Maroons, that, you're not suggesting people run to the fringes and start communes, and how when we look at things like how geography helped people in the past escape taxation and state control, those don't exist. Those barriers to the state no longer exist. But there are potentially other avenues for getting that autonomy, even though you might live in like a city or a state controlled area. I think again in Beyond Civilization, one of the things that Daniel Quinn says that I really appreciated was that um, civilization doesn't have a geography; it's an idea. And so you could do rewilding or solar punk like in a city without being a part of civilization. Like you can separate the ideas. You can be interfaced with them, but there are ways of doing it that can fly under the radar of state surveillance. Harder and harder to do. But that's kind of what I think of when I think of inspiration from immediate return hunter-gatherers or inspiration from Maroons who also like weren't perfect. I remember you having that was part of your conversation at the Rewilding conference about Maroons too, was that, there was definitely elements of Maroon society that you weren't, that you didn't agree with or that didn't,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like I said, in some places they had to collaborate with the colonial powers to ensure their own survival.
totally.
In some cases they were really patriarchal societies.
Yes. Yes.
So it's not
Yeah.
perfection.
Right. Yeah. So I think about that in terms of, where can we find these sort of refuge zones within the geography that are sort of under the radar or, uh, not under the gaze of the colonial empires. I don't know. I think an element of it is like the idea of Frodo and Sam walking through Mordor without Sauron's eye, like finding them or whatever. Like
Yeah.
how can you exist in that? And I don't have the answer to that, but that's kind of where my contemporary thinking is going around rewilding and solar punk and things like that. Is like, where are the places that are invisible to the eye within it? You know?
I think more and more we're seeing that the best place right now to be is just offline,
Mm, mm,
right? I think I'm seeing at least as a trend in my demographic, in my generation, more and more people are looking for ways to divest from the internet, to go back to the analog, to go back to, the more physical and face-to-face and interpersonal and interactive forms of cultural practice and social engagement, limiting or eliminating social media entirely. Data in this day and age in the 21st century in 2025 is liquid gold. Is the new liquid gold, the
what
the
is?
the, digi the digital gold, data.
Oh, data, right. Yes. Yeah,
Yeah, it's
totally.
it's it's a very it's one of the most powerful resources right now that's being tapped into and extracted from all of us. And disengaging from that, I think, is one of the best ways that you can, avoid feeding into that system, and create organic connections, limit the ways that you can be controlled, and honestly just live a healthier life.
Yeah. What would you say to people who are like, well, if you don't have social media, you're not getting the news and that's a place of privilege. Because I hear that a lot when
Well,
I talk about getting off social media.
yeah, I mean, that's the thing, right? The news, the 24-hour news cycle, being constantly exposed to the news, it gives the illusion of being informed, but it's really just a psychological disaster. It's not
Yes.
something that your brain evolved to be able to deal with.
Hmm.
I'm not saying completely unplug from the world, but there are ways to receive news in manageable and sustainable forms, things that do not, you know, completely corrupt your brain and your ability to function and engage with other people. I wouldn't. I would also say that as necessary as it is, stand in solidarity with people all around the world, the scope of your local situation is where you can have the most impact. And it's where I think your focus needs to be. Not to plug your ears, of course, to things going on, because there are genocides happening that we need to speak out about, right? And that solidarity has been crucial to us getting to where we are right now in terms of the global consciousness around, for example, the Palestine issue. But at the same time, there's a lot to be done locally that can destabilize the system as it exists, that can also develop an alternative that can eventually overtake that system. And consuming constant news through the doom scroll is not going to get you any closer to that goal.
Yeah, I agree entirely. Um, I want to shift gears again. Last thematic question of mine. Um, Last year, you were one of the speakers at the annual North American
This year,
Rewilding Conference. Oh yeah. In my mind, it's already a year ago. So because we're planning the next one. So at the previous
right.
annual North American Rewilding Conference, you were one of our speakers. And afterwards, we do what's called an open space, where the community generates the content that is spoken about, and people kind of pick and choose what they're interested in going to. So it's the agenda is created by participants. I know that that was an impactful experience for you, and so I love open space, and I like sharing it with the world and hearing the way other people have been impacted by it. And I thought that would be a cool thing to share with the
Yeah,
rewilding audience, in particular, because to me, it's a way of rewilding a conference and a way of doing it in a kind of organic, what I would consider anarchist way. And so, yeah,
yeah.
if you want to speak to it at all, that would be awesome.
Yeah, I consider it to be an extremely inspiring experience. One of the concepts that I've kind of been toying with in my development of my anarchist theory and stuff is the idea of spaces of encounter, which is something I think Crime Think first coined as
Mm,
a phrase. And it's the spaces where, you know, different individuals and groups are able to engage with each other, not necessarily to reach a totalizing consensus, a unified direction, but to, share notes, to share information, to collaborate. I think the Open Spaces Conference, the Open Spaces Technology is an example of
mm,
that
hmm
in action in
hmm
terms of the exchange of information. And it's a real shame that I haven't gotten to put it into practice in my local context yet. There's just been, delay after delay and distractions and, difficulties getting location, that kind of thing. But I definitely want to bring it to my local context to put it into practice myself because I think it shows it encourages people to take the initiative to be part of the conversation, to not be passive receivers of information, but active participants in shaping both the conversation in the event itself, but also the conversation in broader society.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. You know, it makes me think about, and this is why we wanted to do the conference this way, is that, most conferences are you just go and there's a speaker or a couple of speakers, and the information is flowing one direction from the speaker to
Yeah.
the audience. Um, and in open space, there is no, it's not like that, right? Because open space is a dialogue between different people around topics. So a person, anybody who's there at the conference can put a topic they want to talk about up on the agenda, and then anybody who's at the conference can show up and talk with them about it. Um,
Hmm.
it's hard to sell that to people, I think, because people are wanting there to be experts that disseminate information to them, because that's how a lot of people have been trained to accept knowledge and participate in
Yeah.
quotes. And so that's why we do both, right? Because we can then at the same
Hmm.
time curate who our speakers are going to be, who can then put out information that we think needs to be broadcast. But then also those speakers become participants in the larger community conversation. And so it ends up being a thing where somebody who might be considered an expert is sitting next to and having a conversation with somebody who's never said anything in a public forum before, or isn't might be an expert but isn't like publicly known or something like that, or might not
Yeah.
be an expert at all, but that you're having this actual dialogue with people who care about these issues, and everybody has something interesting to add to the conversation, in my opinion. Um, I think everybody's voice being shared is an important aspect of open space and why it's so powerful because it has the opportunity for that. Not everybody has to speak. You could just go and eavesdrop on a conversation. But that's even that and even in of itself is a kind of participation that you don't get outside of that context, really.
Yeah,
Um, anyway, yeah, I was really excited that you were so inspired by it because to me it's hard to see. I think the irony of it is that I learned about it through the tech community, like tech bros who use it to
hmm,
like solve, it's really popular in that community to solve like coding problems or whatever, like they're really obsessed with open space. Because originally, I think most of at least from my understanding, a lot of the people that were into tech were like anarchists who were hard to manage. And so they came up with systems like agile teams or leaderless teams in software design because a lot of them were anarchists. I don't know if that still exists today, since most of the tech bros seem to be all about Christian fascism. But um,
yeah,
yeah, I think it's really cool to be able to introduce something like open space to an anarchist community as one of those systems that we mentioned, or that you said, anarchism doesn't mean no types of organizing. And so open space is one of those anarchic types of organizing. And yeah, it's just really cool to be able to see people get inspired by it and want to replicate it in their area. And I hope that you're able to do that and tell me how it goes when it happens.
for sure.
Is there anything that you want to ask me?
Yeah, I want to find out more about this next conference. Location, what's happening with it? How's the planning going?
Yeah, so the next annual North American Rewilding Conference will be in Portland again in person. Um, I took a summer sabbatical for mental health from Rewild Portland, and so we're a little behind on some things. We don't have much lined up other than that it's going to be in the same location as it was last year. And we're working on our speakers right now, and hopefully we'll have them by the end of October so we can start promoting it in November. There'll be an online component again. So if people want to
Right.
watch at least the speaker part of it, I don't know if we'll do an online open space. That's a challenge. It depends on the number of participants. We have done that in the past, so there is a potential for that. We just have to have essentially somebody who can facilitate it. Um, and yeah, that's kind of where we're at right now. We're going to meet after this weekend in the committee meeting to brainstorm our speakers and then go from there.
That's cool. That's cool.
Yeah. So,
Hopefully in the future you're somewhere less cold than Portland.
yeah, I mean, it's easy. We're such a small organization. It's really hard for us to
Hmm.
go to other places or to plan for other places.
Yeah, I
If
mean
the
that's what I'm saying. I hope the organization grows, the impact grows, and rewilding as a movement flourishes.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely other organizations around the world that are doing rewilding stuff that use rewilding in the name. Some of them don't for various reasons. Um, but yeah, I really hope that there's the political, there's lots of different ways people interpret the word rewilding. And there's another conference that's happening, a so-called Rewilding conference that's happening somewhere in the US. And it's basically kind of like the watered down, mass marketed version of rewilding that where it converts it from a political project of uh, you know, dismantling barriers of domestication and envisioning a resilient future against hierarchy and sort of positions it as just a metaphor or a synonym for like nature connection and forest bathing, which is unfortunate.
Mm,
So it's a
yeah, it's
conference with lots of speakers and things,
kind of
but
sounds
they're
like the same way decolonization has been watered down.
exactly. Yeah. I mean, everything I think to a degree, people find ways of watering them down when it starts to become a mass marketed thing,
Yeah, Solarpunk
which is
has
unfortunate.
NFTs, if you
Yeah.
didn't know.
I did not know that. Yeah. And it's a thing where people have told me I should trademark the term rewilding because we have a legal precedent to do that. But then it just takes away the whole meaning behind it. right? Like
Yeah.
to do something like that would be to ruin it already, even if it's already tainted by this mass marketed thing, um, it still should be open source, right? It still shouldn't be something that anybody could trademark. That's antithetical to the principles within it. So yeah, I mean, and on some level, even if people think of it as just forest bathing, if there's still people holding down the political side of it, like me and Rewild Portland, and other organizations that are out there, if we can hold that down to some degree, the people who come into it from the nature connections side will be led towards us, right? I think that there's maybe a net gain by having it watered down to a degree, even if it's, this misappropriation that happens where the meaning changes. I think there are people who are seeking, more and more depth to their experiences and more connection. And they start to realize the barriers to those connections are the state and the social structures that we have. Like all of the solutions to the world already exist. The reason they haven't been implemented is because the hierarchy doesn't want them to, because they don't make
Yeah,
profit.
yeah. To borrow the Peter Gelderloos book title, the solutions are already here.
Yeah, yeah. We have them all. We just haven't been able to implement them because the hierarchy is preventing it. And I think if people go down the rabbit hole, they get there. I think
Yeah,
the danger is where is there that they're going to get to? Is it going to be the white supremacist acceleration side of things, or is it going to be, the hopeful anarchist egalitarian side of things? That to me is
yeah,
the sort of the danger of the word gaining this sort of huge ground, because there's different rabbit holes people can end up in,
for
um,
sure.
you know, and so that's my fear around that. But is there anything else that you want to share with the audience? Any last words you want to say that you're like, oh, this came to mind, and I don't want to forget that I should say this thing? And if not,
Not anything in particular. Just want to give a shout to the channel. You can find me on youtube.com/andrism. I have a lot of videos at this point with a lot of different topics that I
yeah.
think this audience will absolutely love.
Hmm.
I reference some of those videos in this very exchange, and you could also check out my website, andrewsage.org. All my links are there.
Awesome. Andrew, thank you so much for coming on the Rewilding podcast. It's been a
Thanks for
pleasure.
having me. It was great to catch up.
Yeah. All right. We'll talk to you again. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Rewilding Podcast. Check out the show notes to connect with my guest and for a list of resources we mentioned in our conversation. If this episode inspired you, made you think more deeply, or gave you some new tools to use, make sure to subscribe and become a patron at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. If you're new to rewilding or want to expand your perception of it, I recommend attending one of my Rewilding 101 workshops, which I offer both in person in Portland, Oregon, and online for those who live around the world via Zoom. You can check upcoming dates and register at rewildportland.com. Thanks for listening.